How's it going, lads? It's the ball boomer Biosparks. With the viewer poll deciding today's topic, I'll be covering the boss fights you'll need or may want some resistance gear for every phase in TBC Classic. In this video, you'll become fully aware of which bosses you should prepare resistance gear ahead of time so you and your guild aren't caught out, especially since Blizzard confirmed we will be getting pre-nerfed versions of bosses. So, let's get straight into it. Resistance gear requirements in TBC Classic will range from helpful but not required once the boss is on a farm, to the other extreme of 100% required. I'm sure many of you will remember when you were preparing for AQ40 and you saw videos explaining how you would need all this nature resistance gear for Princess Huhuran, but then in reality most raids would just be fully world buffed in their DPS gear and just blow her up and use a nature protection potion when she enrages, and pretty much just move on like it's a Sunday stroll through the park. The reason I'm saying this is because there are some fights in TBC Classic that you will just not be able to do this, since the boss fights are longer, you won't have world buffs carrying your raid, and the damage output without resistance gear on some bosses either outright kills you or makes the mana drain for your healers unsustainable. So in phase 1, you will not need any resistance gear at all, which means for Karazhan, Gruul's Lair and Magtheridon's Lair, you can mainly focus on wearing your best in slot items. However, I have seen quite a few people saying on forums that mages will need to invest in fire resistance gear to tank Crush Firehand inside of Gruul's Lair as part of the Ogre Council encounter. This is 100% false, so please do not waste valuable badges of justice buying fire resistance gear, since his fire damage is completely unresistible and the mage simply has to focus on spell sealing his shield and maintaining aggro on him throughout the fight. Although it is recommended that the mage does wear some high stamina gear to help survive incoming damage, and give their healers an easier time. So the Violet badge rocking 36 stamina on a trinket definitely comes in handy, as well as a few stamina gems and some PvP gear. Moving over to phase 2, we have Serpent Shrine Cavern and Tempest Keep. This is where your guild will have needed to use the time available in phase 1 to prepare some resistance items. Hydross the Unstable, the first boss you'll find in Serpent Shrine Cavern. Resistance gear in this encounter is mandatory. Hydross maintains two forms throughout this fight. He has a water form in which he deals pure frost damage, and a poison form in which he deals pure nature damage. I'm sure you can figure out what kind of resistance will be needed here. Although it isn't the whole raid that needs resistance, it's your two tanks which should have 365 resistance for frost or nature accordingly. The reason why resistance gear will be needed is because of the debuffs called Mark of Hydross or Mark of Corruption. The mark is applied every 15 seconds, which affects the entire raid, which stacks up to 6 times. It increases frost or nature damage by 10, 25, 50, 100, 250 and 500% depending on how many stacks you have. So tank swaps should be happening not long after full stacks or you're looking at an impending wipe. With the basic main mechanic out of the way, let's have a look at the gear your tanks will need, starting with frost resistance. You want your tank to hit 295 resistance so that a paladin aura or shaman totem can get them to the 365 resistance cap. Here are the items you'll want to acquire. And here are the materials and reputations you'll need to craft these pieces. I really recommend making a couple of glacial cloaks now in Classic WoW, just in case you end up having new tank characters in the Burning Crusade, since you really don't want to be going back into Naxxramas and grabbing frozen runes just to craft them. And now the same thing with nature resistance. You want to hit 295 so that a hunter aspect or shaman totem can get your tank to 365 resistance. If you want your tank to hit 295 resistance exactly, you'll need to use 1 nature armor kit and the Savage Guard leg enchant from Zul'Gurub, otherwise you'll need to use 3 nature armor kits instead. Here are the materials and reputations you'll need to craft these pieces. Now take a deep breath, because here are all the materials and reputations you'll need for both sets. As you can see, these materials are not a walk in the park, and if you leave it up to one person in your guild to manage all of this, you're simply not going to have the materials or reputation crafters to make these items. So this has to be a combined guild effort, and if everyone chips in with a few primals and some materials, then it doesn't look so daunting. One thing I will say as a warning, and I don't want to sound toxic when I say this, but do not, under any circumstances, give these crafted items to tanks that you feel are going to bail on you. You know the ones who didn't stop talking about Classic WoW before it released and quit before level 30? I'm talking about those guys. The ones who cleared Molten Core a couple of times and then you never saw them again, and now they're knocking on the door telling you how hyped they are for TBC Classic? I'm talking about those guys. The ones you helped craft all their frost resistance gear for Sapphiron and quit after you killed Kel'Thuzad for the first time? I'm talking about those guys. You want these items on the type of tank who has the 1000 yard stare because they are still doing binding runs every single week from phase 1 to phase 6 because he still needs the other half of a Thunder Fury binding. The one you know who won't give up at the first hurdle. That's who you put this equipment on. Next up, we have Leotheras the Blind, who is also in Serpent Shrine Cavern, where resistance gear will be required. You will need a Warlock with maxed out fire resistance to tank the boss when he transforms into a demon. Leotheras will only use the spell Chaos Blast, which will apply a debuff that increases fire damage taken by 1675, which also stacks up to 20 times, meaning that without fire resistance, the Warlock will get killed rather quickly. Luckily for us, 365 fire resistance is nowhere near as bad as the 2 tanks for Hydross. Again, the target number is 295, so a Shaman Totem or Paladin Aura can give the Warlock maximum resistance. The best way to achieve this is to respec and grab 5 points in Master Demonologist for 70 fire resistance when a Fell Hunter pet is active. Next is all 4 pieces of Inferno Weave fire resistance gear, which will require 100 Badges of Justice. So if you want to hit heroic dungeons early, I really recommend you watch my dungeon leveling guide at launch. This now puts you at 270 resistance, and you can finish off with a Pendant of Frozen Flame, which requires a Revered Jewel Crafter with the Keepers of Time to craft, which puts you just over the resistance cap after the aura or totem is applied. The reason why I recommend the Pendant of Frozen Flame instead of Flame Armor kits is that they prevent you from enchanting your fire resistance gear, which can really help the Warlock throughout the fight. So overall, Leotheras is not too bad to prepare for, but if you have a Warlock tank in your guild who's looking for some help farming Badges of Justice, be a good guy and help them out. Especially if it's the Warlock who stuck around for the whole of Classic WoW and tanked Twin Emperors for your guild. Moving on to Tempest Keep, we have High Astromancer Solarian, where Arcane Resistance will be very useful until you have very good gear. Now for those of you who don't know, this boss went through 4 different versions throughout the Burning Crusade. In the first 2 versions, her spells were not affected by resistance gear at all and were extremely difficult. In fact, the first version was never killed. However, I don't think Blizzard will use those versions in TBC Classic, and since we know we will have pre-nerf bosses, it definitely won't be the last very easy version, so my prediction will be that the 3rd iteration of the boss is what we'll be up against. However, that is pure speculation and I could be wrong, but what we do know is that there is going to be a lot of arcane damage thrown around in this encounter. Arcane Resistance will be very useful to deal with Arcane Missiles, Blinding Light which does raid-wide damage, and Wrath of the Astromancer which increases your damage taken by 50%. Be aware that you still need a good amount of DPS in this encounter, so you don't want to start equipping lots of Arcane Resistance gear. The Violet Badge stacked with Improved Mark of the Wild will give a decent amount of resistance, and you can also use Arcane Protection Potions for extra safety while you learn the boss fight. As I said before, there is a chance Blizzard implements one of her harder versions in which Arcane Resistance gear was useless, so keep your ear to the ground regarding this boss fight in particular. Moving into Phase 3, in Battle for Mount Hyjal, we have Kaz'rogal, where Shadow Resistance is extremely useful, but you can get by without it if you're optimizing your mana regeneration and consumables. The main issue in this fight is Mark of Kaz'rogal, which is a raid-wide debuff that drains 600 mana every second for 5 seconds, for a total of 3000 mana. Whatever happens, your mana users have to keep their mana reserves up by any means necessary. This means every class ability and mana consumable like Mana Tide, Innovate, Evocation, Shadow Fiend, Mana Potions, Dark Runes, and so on. Because if you're afflicted by Mark of Kaz'rogal and your mana reserves hit 0, you'll end up exploding, doing 10 to 11,000 shadow damage to yourself and everyone around you, so be very conservative with your mana. In your first attempt at this boss, you won't have access to shadow resistance gear, since it's only available from the Ash Tongue Deathsworn faction in the Black Temple, so you'll have to rely on your class abilities and consumables at first. However, in the following weeks you will have the Medallion of Karabor from the Black Temple Achievement Quest, and epic quality shadow resistance gear which will help you resist the Mark of Kaz'rogal completely. So just by having the Medallion of Karabor, Knight's End, and a Priest Shadow Protection, you will have 150 shadow resistance which will enable you to resist the Mark of Kaz'rogal 30% of the time on average, which is massive for just having 2 items of shadow resistance gear, which makes this boss fight much easier. Next up, we have Mother Shahraz in the Black Temple. Mother Shahraz is a boss fight in which shadow resistance gear is essential for the entire raid, apart from the 3 tanks who can get away with wearing most of their normal tanking gear. For the other 22 members of the raid, they should be pushing 365 shadow resistance as the main priority, since there's going to be a huge amount of shadow damage being thrown around in this fight. This boss fight is mostly tank and spank, since your shadow resistance gear will be absorbing most of the damage. The main mechanic to worry about is Fatal Attraction, which teleports 3 players together and gives them demonic energy. This is a damage over time spell which ticks every second for around 3000 shadow damage to everyone within 15 yards of them. To remove it, all 3 players affected have to move 25 yards away from each other. So while the mechanics of the boss fight are quite simple, the resistance gear requirement for the raid members as soon as the Black Temple is released is going to be the main challenge. I will be dedicating another whole video for securing shadow resistance gear for Mother Shahraz, because the amount of preparation, materials and execution that will be required to down this boss in the first weeks of Black Temple is not to be underestimated, because it's going to be a huge guild-wide effort to obtain enough shadow resistance for the raid. Next up is the Betrayer, Illidan Stormrage himself. In terms of resistance gear, this boss fight is actually very straightforward. You will need 2 tanks with 365 fire resistance gear for phase 2 of the fight, when Illidan summons 2 Flames of Azeroth since they deal pure fire damage. The fire resistance gear is easy to acquire for warriors, paladins and druid tanks. Here's an example of items that you can use to hit 365 resistance that will mostly require 100 badges of justice. Later on in phase 4 of the encounter, Illidan will transform into a demon which will need a shadow resistance capped warlock to tank him. This can be achieved with a full set of the crafted gear from the Ashtan Deathsworn, but if you're struggling for the materials you can always have the warlock respec into Master Demonologist to help close the gap. Moving on to phase 5, we have Sunwell Plateau. Kalecgos is the first boss in there, which requires some arcane resistance to protect against the effect of his arcane buffet. This ability continually increases damage taken by 500 each time you are hit by it. If you had no resistance, then this would quickly start ramping up towards taking 5000 increased damage, which results in unsustainable raid healing. The general recommendation is to use the Violet Badge and the Cloak of Arcane Evasion with a resistance enchant. With improved Mark of the Wild, this will give you 125 resistance, which results in avoiding 25% of the arcane buffets on average, which in turn leads to receiving 43% less damage compared to someone who has no resistance. This encounter requires a high amount of DPS, so raiders can't afford to stack too much arcane resistance, which is why 125 resistance meets that sweet spot of enough survivability without sacrificing too much damage. Felmyst is another boss where our good old friend the Violet Badge will come in handy for guilds learning and progressing on this boss fight. Throughout this encounter, players will be caught by an ability called Encapsulate, which will lift them up into the air and do 5 ticks of arcane damage to all players within 20 yards, doing 3,500 damage per tick. This damage happens very quickly and is quite unpredictable because it is completely random, so having the Violet Badge along with arcane protection potions will assist you and your healers in surviving the burst damage in this fight. Ultimately, your healers will have the main responsibility of healing through this burst damage, and once your guild is familiar with the boss and they have access to more Sunwell level gear, you can consider removing the Violet Badge and arcane protection potions for more damage output. And with that, we have covered all the major boss fights that will either require resistance gear or help the encounters go a little bit more smoothly as you're learning the mechanics. Remember that resistance gear preparation is an entire guild effort, and just leaving a small group or the officer team to deal with it is just going to result in disaster. And with that, thank you very much for watching. This is the Bald Boomer Biosparks, signing out. Catch you lads next time.